Shalom, I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, and welcome to Faith to Faith. No matter what our differences may be, it's our faith that hopefully brings us together to do great things. My guest today is Ambassador Ido Aharoni, the chief spokesperson for Israel in New York since 2011. Ambassador Aharoni faces many challenges, working tirelessly to bring communities, countries, politicians, and media together, reinforcing the strong bond between Israel and the United States, while serving the tri-state area. Welcome, Ambassador Aharoni. I've been privileged to know you for a number of years before you were Consul General of New York, and I've always been inspired by you. You always have that optimistic spirit. If I were to ask you, when you were very young, would you ever consider being Consul General of New York? What would you say?
Absolutely not. I wasn't even aware of the existing of such a position. I'm not the typical Israeli diplomat who had dreams of becoming a diplomat or dealing with international policy making. My interest lied with filmmaking. I was interested in music, and basketball was my big passion growing up. It had nothing to do with world affairs.
So how'd you get involved in politics?
By accident. I'll tell you what happened. I worked for Israeli television during the first Gulf War. I worked for Israel's one of two newscasts we had in Israel at the time. We used to go on live at 5:30 p.m. for 30 minutes. And after the war ended, I expected to be permanently recruited by the station. And when that did not happen, I was bored, disappointed, and so I saw an ad in the paper. And in the paper it said that the Foreign Service, the Israeli Foreign Service, was looking for candidates to join the cadet program. So I presented my candidacy, and there were several screening phases, and I surprisingly passed each and every one of them. And after 5 months, I got a letter from them in the mail, got accepted. Now I had to make a decision what to do. I was young, relatively, 29 years old, and I decided to give it a try, and that's how I ended up here.
How is it possible to represent the different voices of Israel, speaking to the different voices in America? Somebody once said that a Jewish star is a fitting symbol for our people because it's two triangles going in opposite directions. And we often find that to be the case. Contrary opinions, yet you have to present a point of view.
Well, there are two different things. We do not only represent, as when you serve overseas as a diplomat, as an Israeli diplomat, it doesn't matter whether in New York or in Melbourne, Australia, or in Africa. There are two things you have to do. The first is, and it's more within the framework of crisis management, you have to be familiar with the issues at hand, with the policy guidelines, with the message of the day, if you may. And this is usually something that you get from the government, whether by listening to the Prime Minister himself, or you get the talking points, the party line from Jerusalem. But then there's something much bigger, and that is representing the nation, representing the culture, as you say, the diversity that exists in Israel. And luckily, we're all blessed because we represent perhaps one of the most diverse, vibrant communities in the world. We're only 8.2 million Israelis, but with over 100 ethnic groups represented, over 70 languages regularly spoken, tens of additional dialects that exist in Israel, not to mention the richness of the Israeli culture, arts, and customs, and what have you. So it's a real privilege to do that, and I'm so happy. It gives me a lot of energy.
I have found over the years that one of the reasons we argue with each other, one of the reasons we debate or disagree with each other is because of the passion that's contained in our love for Israel. When you love something, you fiercely defend it, you fight for it, and I think it's a good sign. I know some people would prefer we have some kind of unanimity of opinion. That's not going to happen. But when you really care deeply, you don't mind confronting the challenges, even though it's a contrary point of view.
It's true, but I have to tell you, sometimes because people are so emotional, they tend to forget the basic rules of their profession. Let me give you an example. For some odd reason, when it comes to Israel, we forgot the basics of marketing. For some odd reason, for many of us, some of Israel's most devout and most devoted well-wishers, we forgot the basics of what it means to market a country, what it means to market a place. Marketing a place is all about knowing your relative advantage, recognizing your competitive edge, and then it's about communicating it effectively with relevant audiences. For some odd reason, we never did that. If you think about it, the State of Israel is unique in the sense that we made an attempt, a futile attempt in my view, to market our country, to make a good name for our country by constantly discussing our problems. It doesn't work. Yeah. And it's time for us to change that. It's okay to bring up your problems in the conversation, but only after there's a relationship. You don't do it at the start, at the outset. It turns off people. And that's what I'm trying to change. And believe it or not, the most difficult audience for me to convince of the necessity in reversing this order are the well-wishers, the people that deeply care about Israel.
So you think there's some kind of Middle East fatigue? In other words, people are always hear the tsuris, always hear the kvetching. Then after a while they're saying, you know, I can't take anymore.
Right. What would you have said if a certain brand tried to communicate to you their deficiencies and problems first? You'd never consume that brand. Same thing goes for places. New York is a perfect example of a place that really changed its overall image and its overall positioning by changing the conversation. From talking about crime constantly, we started to hear different things about New York. New York as a source of great attractions and so on. And the conversation indeed changed about New York, and with it, the performance of New York changed. And New York today is an amazing place, the capital of the free world, unquestionably. And largely thanks to the fact that someone decided many years ago to change the conversation about New York. So I'm determined to do the same thing about Israel, in our case, because of the hard geopolitical circumstances, it's impossible to ignore the situation on the ground. So what we're trying to do is not change the conversation, but rather expand the conversation, broaden the conversation so that it will include all the other assets and facets of Israel that are attractive and relevant to the American consumer.
How do you do that when you have sometimes members of the media who only look to point out the flaws? You pick up some of the papers, whether it's in New York or elsewhere, and you'll read more negative stories about Israel in particular than any other country. It's held to a standard that no one else is held to.
It's true, and we feel sometimes that Israel is being treated unfairly, mostly in Europe, by the way, not so much in the United States. But I have to tell you, as someone who is a former member of the press corps myself, the media is not our problem. The media is part of the solution. What do I mean by that? It's true that there's some people, and they will always be there, by the way, some people, for them, Israel doesn't exist outside the context of the Israeli-Palestinian / Israeli-Arab conflict. No matter what they do, when they write about Omri Caspi, who's the Israeli playing for the NBA, they somehow end up asking questions about the Palestinians. When they write about an Israeli chef whose name is Yotam Ottolenghi, they end up writing about his positions on the Palestinian conflict. They will always be there. However, the solution is with other members of the press, and we have to remember that the vast majority of Americans, as well as the vast majority of American journalists, are not interested in Middle East geopolitics. They're interested in whatever they're covering. So if someone is covering food or sports or culture or the arts or technology or medicine, let's take them to Israel and show them how Israel is making the world a better place every day. And it's possible. We've done it before, and all we need to do is to continue doing that. I can tell you, vast majority, and this is all empirically tested, the vast majority of Americans, if you will force them to take a stand, they will take a stand, but the vast majority of Americans voluntarily will not take a stand on the Middle East. They simply don't care. And it's a great advantage for us when we're trying to broaden the conversation about Israel. Let's find what is it that makes them tick, what is it that they're interested in, and then let's deliver Israel's message on those issues to them.
All right, but let's look at some of the problems. I was in Israel recently, and we went with a bipartisan delegation. Congressman Peter King, former Governor David Paterson, Republican and Democrat. We traveled with rabbis, with lay people during Operation Protective Edge, and a missile overhead in Ashkelon. Iron Dome thankfully took out the missile. And everyone at that moment said, "Thank you, America." The bond between Israel and America is strong. Again, you pick up the paper, you'll read about disagreements. We're going through a period that's cold as opposed to warm. How do you deal with that?
Well, there's an old cliche, if it bleeds, it leads. The media will always look for the tension, will always look for, that's where they believe the story is. But you're right. You were in Israel, and shortly before you were in Israel, I was in Israel. I was privileged to accompany the Governor Andrew Cuomo, who was heading a bipartisan delegation of the political leadership of the state of New York to Israel. And we just had our Minister of Defense, Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, Major General retired Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, who was here. And I can tell you that we've heard the same message from all of the Israeli leaders and the American leaders. The level, the depth, and the scope of the cooperation between the two countries, especially when it comes to security, is unprecedented. And so headlines is one thing, and realities on the ground is another thing. You mentioned the Iron Dome system. The Iron Dome system, and I'd like our viewers to think about that for a second. The Iron Dome system not only saved the lives of thousands of Israelis, because the interception ratio, the successful interception ratio was over 90%, but also indirectly saved the lives of thousands of Palestinians, which is something we don't think about. Because a harsh Israeli response would have created a great deal of damage on the other side. So the story is not being told often the way we'd like it to be told, but the fact speaks for themselves, and I think very loudly and very clearly.
So where are we now? We have a conflict that just subsided. Many people think there's going to be a return to warfare there. We have no negotiations taking place at the present time. It's very easy to be despondent and say there's no hope for the future.
Look, if someone assumes that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not only the only important conflict in the Middle East, but also the only key to the understanding of what's happening in the Middle East, then you're probably right. We are in dire straits. Is not going anywhere. Abu Mazen is reluctant to resume the negotiations. We know the story. We follow the news. But if you look at what's happening on a regional scale, from up above, from 30,000 feet, you see a different picture. What you see is yet another eruption of a 1,500-year-old rift between Sunnis and Shiites. Mm-hmm. You see many active conflicts, military, tribal, and religious in our region. Israeli-Palestinian conflict is only one of many active conflicts. And in fact, in terms of size and impact, it's not even in the top 10. Now look at what's happening in Syria. Over 200,000 people died in less than 4 years, which is 4 times the number of Palestinians that died in a century of belligerency between Jews and Palestinians in the Holy Land. So these are the proportions. And then you see the disintegration of the nation-state system in the Middle East in the last 4 years since the beginning of the so-called the Arab Spring. And perhaps most importantly, you're beginning to see the realignment of the boundaries and the borders of the countries in the Middle East that were created largely as a result of the First World War. We all know the story of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 and so on. And that realignment process is very painful, it's very violent, and most importantly, we have to realize it's not going to be over soon. We're looking at an historical tectonic shift that may last a generation or two, and I even heard some experts that believe that the Islamic world is entering the same phase that Europe entered hundreds of years ago, and it will take many generations before they will be fully realigned. Now, if you understand that picture, you understand the last confrontation between Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza as yet another bloody chapter of a century-old Arab-Palestinian onslaught on Jewish national sovereignty in the Holy Land. And I believe it's the only relevant context for our discussion because, and this is not my opinion, this is a fact of life, in the last 100 years, there was never a point where the Arabs or the Palestinians said, yes, we fully, authentically, genuinely recognize the state of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people. It never happened. It's a fact of life.
I think you said recently that here you have Abu Mazen traveling the international circuit, and all he has to do is make a phone call from Ramallah to Jerusalem and say, let's sit down and let's bring this to a proper resolution. And maybe we'd see a new era, at least in terms of Israel and the Palestinians. But yet he has chosen, for some reason, to go elsewhere rather than to talk directly. How do you understand that kind of mentality?
Because I think people fall in love with headlines, and they truly believe that everything begins and ends with public relations and that the power of media is unlimited. And I think this is where it's coming from. This ill-conceived strategy is very clear to us. And the strategy is to try to embarrass Israel in international forums, and the United States, by the way. Israel and the United States are in the same boat in the eyes of the Palestinians. And because they truly believe that the public opinion and the media coverage is the tool that will apply pressure on Israel. They truly believe that. They truly believe that making an appeal to a third party, whether it's the British Parliament or the Swedish government or the or liberal media outlets in the Western world, is going to exert the pressure on the Israeli government that will yield the result that they're looking for. But the truth is that every inch of progress that was achieved between Israelis and Palestinians in the last 20 years, and as someone who worked with Shimon Peres in the early 90s, I was there, and I can attest to it. It is possible to achieve progress between Israelis and Palestinians. Every inch of that progress was achieved through direct negotiations. Oslo was negotiated directly between Israelis and Palestinians. The Norwegians were the facilitators. They were not the mediators. They were sitting outside when we were negotiating with the Palestinians. So the lesson to be learned here is that, you know, the road to peace goes through Jerusalem for Abu Mazen. It doesn't go through Sweden. It doesn't go through London. It doesn't even go through Washington, D.C. It goes through Jerusalem. You want to have peace with us, you have to talk to us. Nothing's going to happen unless you talk to us. So what do you say
when people will ask the following? And I find young people who aren't familiar with all the details will say, well, look at all the settlements. You're expanding with settlements. You don't really want peace. You just want to change the facts on the ground. So Abu Mazen has no choice but to go elsewhere since he can't really have any satisfaction talking directly.
Well, it's part of the very same fascination with public relations. They truly believe, again, that they found Israel's weakest point. But the truth is that settlements was never the problem. I can, you know, there are many things I can say about that, but it was never the problem. Let me just say this. If you read every account of what actually happened in Camp David, it's true that in the summer of 2000, under the auspices of President Clinton, both sides were convened in Camp David. We did not sign an agreement in Camp David. However, if you read the accounts of what actually happened in Camp David, all agree there was a one point of agreement, albeit verbal, that within the framework of a future agreement, Israel will maintain settlement blocks. In other words, everybody knows that no matter what the details of the future agreements may look like, certain settlement blocks will remain under Israeli sovereignty, part of the state of Israel. We also know that in past agreements, Israel removed settlements. It was not a problem for us to remove settlements in the Sinai after the signing of the agreement with the Egyptians. There was not a problem for us to remove settlements as part of the signing agreement with the Jordanians, although we did not remove actual settlements, but we leased land from the Jordanians. And of course, look at what happened in the summer of 2005 when Israel unilaterally fulfilled the Palestinian territorial fantasy. So the people that believe that the problem is territorial have this fixation of settlements. And I can understand where it's coming from. However, they should be aware of the fact that in the eyes of most Israelis, and in the eyes, I believe, of every person who thoroughly studied the history of the Middle East conflict, the issue at hand is not territorial. As Prime Minister Netanyahu always says, it was never about the Palestinian state. It was always about the Jewish state. In other words, the issue at hand is not whether the Palestinians are going to have the territory they want. It's not about boundaries. It's about their ongoing refusal to accept our right to exist.
I remember when Israel withdrew from Gaza, very painful decision, a lot of emotion, and many people were predicting now we have a new day, a new era in relations between the people in Gaza and the people of Israel. Greenhouses, businesses were left for them to expand the economy, and all for naught.
Well, it was a wonderful example of the kind of mindset that convinced Israelis that the issue at hand is not necessarily territorial. Because here you had the Israeli government, as I said before, fulfilling the Palestinian territorial fantasy to the letter until the very last square inch. And what did the Palestinians do with this golden opportunity? And by the way, we have to remind our viewers that in the beginning, it wasn't Hamas that controlled Gaza in 2005, 2006. It was still the Palestinian Authority. Hamas came later. And so it's a big question. And it's true that for the uninformed, it may look like settlements is the main obstacle. And I can understand, again, that kind of conversation. But when you see the bigger picture, and when you consider Israel's performance over the years, you know that settlements is an issue that can be easily resolved. And I have to tell you one more thing. I learned in my years in diplomacy that the agreements written by attorneys is an important thing, but goodwill is more important. In other words, the most brilliantly worded agreement can be a colossal failure on the ground. On the other hand, the most haphazardly put together agreement can be a big success on the ground if there is goodwill. And right now, what we're seeing is lack of goodwill on the other side. They are, as I said, determined to take us to the multilateral arena, trying to embarrass Israel, trying to do things that are PR motivated. And I think that at the end of the day, they are inflicting harm on their own people.
How worried are you, the people of Israel, about BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, this campaign to delegitimize products manufactured in certain areas of Israel?
Well, we certainly see many sporadic attempts, again, to generate this conversation about boycotting Israel and so on. But I have to tell you, it's not happening in the governmental level. It's not happening in the corporate level. It's not even happening on campus, contrary to our perception. And I think I have the authority to say that because I visit campuses on a weekly basis. Only yesterday I was here in Long Island University. Tomorrow I'll be giving a big talk at Stony Brook. I visit university campuses about 50 a year in this country. And I also had the privilege of addressing some university students in Europe and in Canada in recent years. And so I have a pretty good understanding of what's happening on campus. So even there, it's not taking off in a big way. It happens on the fringe. However, it doesn't mean that this is not an issue that we have to deal with. It doesn't mean that we should not be concerned with it. We have to remember one thing. Singling out, it's okay to be critical of Israel. And we believe, we are not afraid of criticism. We believe we have great answers to all the questions. And this is exactly what I do when I'm on campus. However, when you run into an entity that singles out Israel, that takes the only democracy in the Middle East, the only country in the Middle East where people can be free to be whatever they want. They can be gay, they can be whatever it is that they want to be. The only place where women have full rights, the only place where Arabs actually have full rights, the only place where you have full freedom of speech, the only place that have the rule of law, the Israeli judiciary is strong and active and proactive. And you take that country and you single it out for no reason, then I have to say, with you, I'm not going to have that conversation. And there's a point where we, the Israelis, have to say that. I'm not having that conversation with the association of some obscure organization on campus that decides to boycott Israel for whatever reason.
Same standard for everyone. not one standing for Israel and everyone else has a different one. Years ago, there was a typographical error with Israel. It was spelled I-S-R-E-A-L.
Israel.
Israel. Thankfully, we have Israel that's real. All right. I want to thank you, Ambassador Aharoni, for being with us today. Again, you stand tall. In many ways, you stand tall, but we are proud to stand with you.
We didn't say anything about sports today.
That's after the interview. Remember, we have different faiths. We may have different faces, but above all, we must see each other as members of one human family. A great Jewish sage said, if you believe it can be broken, then know it can also be fixed. When we speak faith to faith, we know we can find the right way to fix the problems of our world. Thank you for watching Faith to Faith, the place that leads to greater understanding. The New York Board of Rabbis and Faith to Faith TV would like to thank Marilyn and Marty Metz for their generous support of this program.